Good evening. Welcome to the Sacramento Public Library. I am Kathy Crosswaite. I'm the Deputy Director over Public Services here. And I do want to thank you for attending this evening's event. It is one of my favorites. And I know that even though you or your friends, mostly your friends, might not have been able to come to this in person, there'll be a lot of people viewing this for the information they need. I want to remind you that if you don't have a library card, I recommend that you get one. Yes, I'm using this platform for my own use. It can open up a whole world of possibilities and wonder. And don't forget that you can vote at the library. Your ballot can be dropped off at 25 of our locations, and if you want to use a vote center, 13 of our branches are hosting those. And finally, restrooms can be accessed on either side of the hallway. So either right through those doors or right through the door right there. So, on to our event. The Project for an Informed Electorate's mission is to empower citizens by fostering a greater understanding of politics, policy, and government. It is dedicated to identifying, creating, and disseminating accurate, trustworthy, open, and nonpartisan information. In other words, thanks to Professor Nalder and her team, we can cut through the noise and get to the heart of the matter. They help us understand the facts so that we can make the best decisions for our communities. I'd like to introduce Professor Kim Nalder, Professor of Political Science at Sacramento State and Director of the Project for an Informed Electorate.
Thank you. Well, welcome to the Initiative Explainer. We've been doing this for many years in conjunction with the Public Library and also with the very good advice from the Legislative Analyst's Office. They're also nonpartisan. We share a mission in many ways. And we hope that you've got your ballots with you or your guides or whatever you have, and hopefully you'll be set after this. So yes, there we go, awesome. So I just wanted to, before we get going, say we will have videos made from this event that are per initiative, that are produced by our lovely team from Sacramento State here. They will be available online at the PI website with the web address right here in just a few days, and please share them with any California voter you can because they're very useful, as you'll see today. Also, we have some additional PI events coming up. We have a guide to election week. These are on campus. That is coming up on October 23rd. And we have an art exhibit. This is the first time we've done this, where we solicited people to submit art projects that are related to the theme of why we vote. Those are on the second floor of the Student Union. And then we're doing a post-mortem with the Center for California Studies on November 20th, where we'll just kind of look at what the hell just happened with the election. We'll see what happened. We might not even know yet, actually. We'll see. So check those out. Those are also listed on the PI website. And then this is being recorded. It will be posted online. We would love your questions, though. So the way we'll proceed is the folks from the LAO will explain what the initiative does. Then I'll provide some additional information about it, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. There's a microphone over there if you want to line up while we're doing the presentation. If you have a clarification sort of question on that ballot measure, this is your chance to ask it to people who probably have done more homework than anyone else. We also will have a roving mic. If anybody doesn't want to get up, you can raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you then. All right, so with no further ado, let's get to Proposition 2.
I'm Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Before I start talking about Prop 2, I do want to briefly talk about our office and our role in the ballot measure process. So we are a nonpartisan advisor to the state legislature, and state law has a specific role for our office when it comes to the ballot measures. So specifically, we must prepare an impartial analysis that describes the measure, and then also provide an estimate of the fiscal effects of the measure on state and local government. And that information is included in the voter information guide that's published by the Secretary of State. So what you'll be hearing from us today is based on that work that we've done for that publication. Okay, so now moving on to Prop 2. So Proposition 2 would authorize the state to sell $10 billion in general obligation bonds for school and community college facilities. So briefly, just to give you a little bit of background on how we fund school and community college facilities in California. Over the last few decades, the state has, it's really been a shared relationship between the state and local districts, school districts and community college districts. And in general, both the state and local governments have relied on general obligation bonds to cover their portion of the costs. The state by passing statewide ballot measures like Prop 2, and locals by passing their own local measures that typically require a 55% vote from their voters. So in K-12 education, there is a school facility program that has been around for more than 2 decades, and that typically statewide bond measures, bond funds are deposited into an account where that fund can be allocated for these projects. And that school facility program has 2 major elements. There's one that's for new construction, so building new schools, and then there's another that's for modernization, which is for renovating existing buildings that are more than 25 years old. For community colleges, it works a little differently. There's local districts submit their projects to the statewide chancellor's office, and then there's a prioritization that occurs, kind of thinking about what might be the most important priority projects, and then the specific projects are actually funded in the state budget every year. So in terms of Proposition 2, of the $10 billion, $8.5 billion is for K-12 education. Of that amount, $4 billion is for modernization, $3.3 billion is for new construction, and then there's $600 million apiece for career technical education facilities and for charter school facilities. For community colleges, there's $1.5 billion, and there's no specific earmark associated with, in terms of the specific kinds of community college projects that would be funded. There are also several minor changes to the K-12 school facility program in Proposition 2. I won't go into all of them, but I will just highlight a couple of important ones. First, there is a change in what the expectation is for the local match. So in the school facility program, typically for a new construction project, the state covers 50% of the costs. And then for a modernization project, the state covers 60% of the costs. There's a potential for additional funding to be covered by the state, just another 5 percentage points, so from 50 to 55%, or from 60 to 65%. And the exact percentage will depend on a school district's percentage of their student population that's either low income or an English learner, and also looking at the property values per student within the district. So a larger proportion of low income students and a relatively lower share of property values per student would mean that there would be a higher share provided. There's also an additional, within the modernization program, there's an additional add-on that allows districts to receive additional funding if they want to build a new building or if they want to renovate an existing building for transitional kindergarten. And transitional kindergarten is a program it's a program for 4-year-olds in California, and the state is in the process of expanding that program so that by the 25-26 school year, all 4-year-olds would be eligible for transitional kindergarten, and so there are some facility needs locally to make sure that they can serve all students. So those are the 2 major ones that I'll highlight there. In terms of the fiscal effect, we estimate that the cost of paying off the $10 billion in bonds would be $500 million annually over 35 years, and that would cover both the principal and interest associated with the bonds.
All right, thank you so much. So if you have questions, get them ready. We're going to go through a few more things on this, but this, as with any bond measure, was put on the ballot by the state legislature. They all have to go before the people because it's our tax money that will be paying back the bond. So the groups that are in support of this in terms of endorsements, we have basically labor groups and educational groups, but I wanted to highlight the very unusual thing, which is that both major political parties are in favor of this one. So, we thought bipartisanship was dead, but here we go. The only group that's come out officially against this is the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association. They're always concerned about tax money, right, about spending for the state, and so they're against it for that reason. And the newspaper endorsements, it's kind of split. We have the San Francisco Chronicle, Sacramento Bee, LA Times endorsing it. And then in opposition, East Bay Times, Southern California News Group, and San Diego Union Tribune. And then in terms of funding for the contributions, we've got basically building organizations and teaching organizations. So the building organizations, of course, would end up doing the work to do the construction on the sites, and obviously the teaching organizations want it for their reasons. No spending against. So when we look at these, we can, kind of think about the lopsided spending for advertising. You may have seen some ads in favor of this one, probably none against, because there's no money against. So what questions do you have on this one?
I'm not sure. Is this on?
Yeah, get close to it.
Okay. Is that better?
Perfect.
So one of the biggest questions that I have, I understand that how it will be allocated, a significant portion is on disadvantaged schools and that type of thing. But many times when you have districts that are smaller as well as disadvantaged, they don't have the staff to even know how to apply for this money. So it still ends up going to those that are larger districts that have the significant staff that can actually apply for this type of money. What type of, supports are there, or are there any supports in here for those where you have a small school district, maybe it's only 2,000 kids or 5,000 kids or less, and they're very poor, very rural. How do they get the funding for this?
So there are actually a few things that are included in Proposition 2. One is that there is a set-aside amount, I believe it's 10%, for small school districts, which is defined as those that have less than 2,500 students. So that the program is typically a first-come, first-served basis. So that set-aside means that for those, if it takes some more time to get an application in, that there would be some amount set aside there. There is an additional $5 million that's included. It's not something I covered here, but it's really building off of federal funding that the state received that's intended to support small and rural school districts with their facilities needs. And so I believe there was $5 million that was provided by the federal government recently, and the Prop 2 would provide an additional $5 million with the intent being that money could serve or support additional school districts that might need help with getting some of their applications in and addressing their facility needs.
Any other questions on Prop 2? All right. Proposition 3.
Thank you. Ryan Miller with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Proposition 3 concerns marriage. First, I'll start with a little bit of background. Prior to 2008, same-sex couples were not allowed to marry in California. But in 2008, the state Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples could be married. That was in effect for several months, and then in November 2008, the voters passed Proposition 8, which prohibited same-sex couples from being married in California. That remained the law until 2010, when federal courts ruled that Proposition 8 was unconstitutional. And that has been the law in California since 2010. But despite this change in the law, the language from Proposition 8 remains in the state constitution. So Proposition 3 would strike that language, that voided language, and it would replace that with language that's consistent with who can currently be married in California. Because there would not be a change in who could be married, we estimate that there would be no change in costs or revenues to state and local governments.
All right, once again, this was put on the ballot by the state legislature. The reasoning behind it is that there was Justice Thomas in the Dobbs decision made some gestures towards possibly using the same reasoning to overturn Obergefell, which is the decision that allowed same-sex marriage nationally. And so there's some chance that if that should happen, then Prop 8 would go back into effect in California unless this change happens. So in support, we have Equality California, which is a LGBTQ advocacy group, the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, an association of family therapists and marriage therapists, the Democratic Party, the governor, the League of Women Voters, Labor, and the Chamber of Commerce. And then against it, we have the California Family Council and the American Council of Evangelicals. And then as far as newspapers, there's only support in terms of endorsements from newspapers, most of the major ones in the state, and none have come out against it. And then the funding is also very lopsided, where we have Kevin DeLeon, who has a campaign fund for 2026 for lieutenant governor, has put his money behind several of these initiatives in order to do advertising this year. Draw your own conclusions. And then we have other senators, teachers associations, nurses, various other groups in the state. So there's, a chunk of money in favor of it and none against. What questions do you have about Prop 3? All right, it's not a complicated one, so let's move along. All right, Proposition 4.
My name is Helen Kirstein with the Legislative Analyst's Office. So Proposition 4 authorizes the state to sell $10 billion of bonds for various natural resources and climate-related activities. So those activities fit within 8 broad categories. I'm going to try to go through them pretty quickly because there are a number of them. The biggest category that would be funded by this bond is $3.8 billion, which would go to various drought, flood, and water supply activities. Then the next biggest allocation is for forest health and wildfire prevention activities. That's $1.5 billion. Then there would be $1.2 billion each for sea level rise in coastal areas and for land conservation and habitat restoration. Next, there's $850 million that would go towards energy infrastructure, $700 million that would go towards parks, $450 million that would go to extreme heat-related activities, and $300 million that would go to farms and agriculture. So notably, even though there are these 8 broad subcategories, there are roughly 100 specific allocations and subcategories, really, for how the amounts would be spent in the bond. So in some cases, the bond allocates money to specific areas of the state or specific programs within those broad activities. Much of the funding that would be provided by Proposition 4 would likely go out as grants, and a lot of that would go to local agencies, nonprofits, tribes, and in some cases, private entities as well. Some of the funding, though, would be set aside for state agencies to administer projects themselves. So in terms of the main fiscal effects, we think the biggest fiscal effect for the state would be repaying the bonds, which are borrowing the state would incur. We estimate the cost to taxpayers to repay the bond would be about $400 million per year over a 40-year period. Those repayments would come from the state's general fund, which is the state's main operating account. With regard to local governments, there are probably a variety of different fiscal effects, but we think that, on net, there would likely be savings to local governments. This is because we think that there's a high likelihood that local governments would receive funding for some activities that they would probably already do, although maybe potentially on a different timeline absent this funding. So for example, some funding could go towards drinking water projects that local governments might already undertake to meet compliance obligations. So we think the level of savings is somewhat uncertain in this area, but we do think it could average in the tens of millions of dollars per year for a few decades. The other fiscal effect that I just wanted to mention is that to the extent that the funding in this bond was successful at reducing the risks of disasters, and in some cases, for example, there's funding for some flood control projects and wildfire mitigation projects. So if those projects were successful at reducing those disasters, then there could be some savings to state and local governments associated with responding or rebuilding from those disasters. But we think that the amount of savings is pretty uncertain there, so we weren't able to quantify it.
Thank you. So one of the things I think that is important for understanding this one is that the legislature had originally allocated about an additional $10 billion to similar sorts of projects, but they cut back because of the condition of the budget this year. So in some ways, this is an attempt to backfill that money. It's put on the ballot by the legislature. In support, we have the National Wildlife Federation, Professional Firefighters, Clean Water Action, labor, teachers, the California League of Women Voters, the Democratic Party, Water Districts Municipal Utility Association, against Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, again, because we didn't incur costs as taxpayers, The Republican Party of California is against it, and then several legislative leaders who are Republicans. Newspapers are split. The Sacramento Bee, San Francisco Chronicle, and the LA Times are in favor. And then in opposition, we have the Southern California News Group, which is a group of a bunch of smaller California local publications, and then the East Bay Times and San Diego Union Tribune. And then in support, we have Save the Redwoods League, State Parks, another Redwood organization, so it's, you know, sort of green organizations, also contractors, and park foundations, and then there's no money in opposition to this measure. So it's completely lopsided. What questions do you have about Prop 4? You have a roving mic. Good.
Hi. I was just wondering if there's anything in the text of the...
Could you hold the mic a little closer? Thank you.
Is this better? Anything in the text of the bill that would prevent the energy infrastructure funding from going to fossil fuel infrastructure?
Yeah, so there are some specific, it's not really related to fossil fuel activities. So the money for the energy piece would go towards transmission financing, battery storage, and improvements at ports that are intended to support the development of offshore wind. So at least my understanding is they're not really aimed at the fossil fuel side. Although I suppose electric transmission, you know, you could use that perhaps for a variety of different, to support a variety of different types of energy generation, you know, activities. But there's nothing, as I see it, that's sort of directed at that.
Great. Another question over here?
Sure. I'm just wondering about the context. How much of an increase to the budget would this be? Like, how much are we already giving out in grant money for these projects?
Yeah, and it partly depends on which category. But for example, I think in our recent budgets, we had a pretty robust general fund for a few years, and we allocated over $30 billion towards various climate activities on a one-time basis spread over a few years. And this would, you know, then we did reduce some of that, but still kept over $30 billion. So that kind of gives you a little bit of context there. But I don't have right in front of me the total amount, and it sort of depends. I think I have it, well, I should have it. I guess I do have it sort of here. It depends on the year, but I think it's been kind of in the range of between, it looks like, I don't know, maybe around 10, 15 billion, it depends on the year, and from a variety of different sources for kind of climate and resources.
Thank you.
And another question?
Yeah, I was wondering if the LAO had spent any time with the impact that these funds that go towards kind of climate crisis response would have on the insurance industry, and whether or not it will help to keep insurers in the state and reduce rate for ratepayers.
So we haven't done a specific analysis of how this bond would affect the insurance industry. I guess one thing I would note is I think the main place where this could relate to the insurance industry is in the wildfire space. That's been an area where insurers have had a number of concerns, and we've seen some pullbacks in insurers being willing to cover high-risk properties. So that is a significant allocation in total, $1.5 billion. And some of that is sort of more directly related to kind of home hardening and defensible space, and some of it's sort of broader. But you know, I think there are also other funding sources that the state is allocating in this space, and probably the sort of amount of, you know, to treat all of the acres across the state, for example, or to harden all of the homes, certainly would not be feasible within this total amount. So this potentially could provide some assistance, certainly in that area, but it's unlikely to sort of, I think, it's not enough that, you know, we'd be able to eliminate the issue of insurance, I think, in the state. I think that's still probably going to be a continuing issue. just given the magnitude of that challenge.
Thank you.
Prop 5.
Good evening. So, like the state, local governments are required to get voter approval in order to issue general obligation bonds. Proposition 5 would change the voter threshold for general obligation bonds that would support housing or public infrastructure. Specifically, the measure would change that voter threshold from a 2/3 approval requirement to a 55% voter approval requirement. So the measure itself is not approving any bonds. It is simply changing the threshold by which local governments have to get the approval of their local voters in order to do so. It also applies to any measures that are on this November ballot, if it were to be approved. In looking at the fiscal effects of this measure, we looked at a number of recent elections and found that roughly 20 to 50% of additional bond measures, depending on the election, would have otherwise passed with this lower threshold. Those measures would have raised a couple of $2 billion across the state. So were this measure to pass, we would anticipate seeing more local bond measures for public infrastructure and housing to pass that would result in increased borrowing to support those activities. And those bonds, the repayment of those bonds, are paid with higher property taxes.
Okay, great. The state legislature put this one on the ballot. The support comes from the Democratic Party, California State Building and Trades Council, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which will be a recurrent theme in a bunch of these, California Yes in My Backyard, California Labor Federation, League of Women Voters, and the United Way Bay Area. And then opposition, we have the California Chamber of Commerce, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association again, National Federation of Independent Businesses, California Republican Party is against, and then Catalyst for Local Control. The LA Times and Sacramento Bee came out in favor of this, and then these other newspapers across the state, including the San Francisco Chronicle and the Southern California News Group, East Bay Times, and San Diego Union Tribune, all against. So the money on this one, in support, we have about $5 million coming from the Zuckerbergs, each of them giving $2.5 million. And then in opposition, we have realtor organizations for the most part, and the California Business Roundtable, but organizations that probably make sense for the purposes of this initiative. But there's a lot more money against this, so you may see more advertising on the no side than you do on the yes side on this measure. What questions do you have?
Okay, so one of my biggest questions, because this has been one of those where to raise taxes is always that 2/3. And then with schools, in order for them to raise bonds for their infrastructure, they went and they had to get it changed so that it could drop to 55%. So it sounds like we're kind of chipping away at this 2/3. Not that I'm in a disagreement. I think that it needs to be changed because it seems like this is only for housing, correct? It's very narrow. And it's like we have to go back to the ballot each time to get this threshold from 2/3 down to something more reasonable, or 55%. So do I have that understanding correct?
Mostly, yes. So it is correct that the Constitution states that in order for local governments to issue general obligation bonds, they have to get voter approval. And under I believe it was Proposition 13, that level was set at 2/3. In 2000, Proposition 39 changed that threshold for school bonds only to be 55%. And so this measure does parallel Proposition 39 to change that voter requirement, but for housing as well as public infrastructure. So that could include roads, water projects, utilities, a pretty wide variety of local capital projects. So it is, it does apply to a large component of what general obligation bonds typically are issued for by local governments.
Is there any chance that, maybe this is anathema to most people, almost a repeal of that Prop 13, because setting that 2/3 threshold is so high and it makes it so difficult to get things that we really need in general just to try and get the housing. And even Prop 13 obviously is not a solution for everything, because you have some property owners, mostly commercial, that don't have to increase their property taxes except by 2%, but yet you have residential who are seeing these prices go crazy because we don't live as long as many corporations.
So you're referencing the cap on property taxes instituted by Proposition 13. That is not addressed in this particular ballot measure. It did go to the voters in some components in 2020, but it did not pass.
Fun fact, Prop 13 imposed a 2/3 requirement, but it did not pass by a full 2/3 itself. All right, Proposition 6.
Good evening. I'm going to start by providing some very brief background, which is that the California Constitution bans involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. In addition, people in prison and jail can be required to work or do other activities like attend school. People who work in prison or jail are often paid, often less than $1 an hour. They can also sometimes earn credit off their prison or jail sentence in exchange for working. And people who refuse to work or do other activities that they're assigned, like taking classes, can face consequences like losing the ability to make regular phone calls, for example. Moving on to what Proposition 6 would do, it would remove that exception language from the Constitution, or the state constitution. In other words, it would ban involuntary servitude in all cases, including as punishment for a crime. It also bans prisons from disciplining people who refuse to work. However, Prop 6 states that it does not stop prisons from giving people credit, i.e. time off their sentence, in exchange for voluntarily accepting a work assignment. In terms of the fiscal effects, we found that they're uncertain because they would depend on how the rules around work for people in prison and jail are changed in response to the measure, as well as how people respond to those new rules. So, for example, if people in prison and jail can no longer face consequences for refusing to work, prisons and jails might have to find other ways to encourage people to work. So, for example, they might choose to pay people more, which would increase costs. On the other hand, they might choose to offer additional credits in exchange for working, which would reduce the amount of time people spend in prison or jail and therefore reduce costs. So we found that any potential increase or decrease in state and local criminal justice costs would likely not exceed the tens of millions of dollars each year.
Thank you. This got there through the state legislature. In support, we have the ACLU, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, the Democratic Party, the California Teachers Association, the California Black Legislative Caucus. So this was part of the reparations discussions that were going on in the legislature, the California Labor Federation, League of Women Voters, and the Council on American and Islamic Relations. And then in opposition, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and the California Republican Party. In support, the SAC-B, the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and in opposition, San Diego Union Tribune, East Bay Times, and Pasadena Star News. And then the funding, we have various organizations that are education organizations, anti-recidivism, individuals who have donated money, California African American PAC, United Domestic Workers for American Action Fund, Teachers Association, so various donors there, and no funding in opposition to this. So 1.2 million have been raised in favor and none against. What questions do you have about this one?
Just a curiosity question. Is there any data on how extensive this this problem of involuntary servitude in the prisons is? Do you have any data on that you can cite? That's my question.
The Constitution doesn't define involuntary servitude, so it's not entirely clear what current exact current practices are authorized or currently existing under that term being in the Constitution. For that reason, I don't think we could really define exactly what a specific problem exactly. But if you want to ask follow-up questions, I might be able to drill down a little bit more.
So are prisoners currently engaged in work which they did not volunteer for?
So state law requires the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which operates the prisons, to require every able-bodied person to work as prescribed by their regulations. So CDCR regulations essentially say that everyone is obligated to work as assigned by the department staff, and assignments may be up to a full day of work or other programs, including rehabilitative programs. So essentially the regulations say, unless you have some kind of medical or other reason why you can't work, you're pretty much supposed to be engaged in something, whether that's what we think of as work in the more traditional sense, or school, or some kind of treatment program, or a combination. So that is kind of the current status, and people can be required to engage in those activities, and if they refuse, then there can be disciplinary consequences. But there are also incentives for people to work as well, like pay, for example, right now. So there's kind of a carrot and stick system, if you will, right now, that encourages people to engage in some kind of activity while they're incarcerated. There is a companion bill that was passed that was signed by the governor and would go into effect if the proposition passes, that directs CDCR to develop a voluntary work program and prescribe the rules and regulations regarding work and programming assignments for individuals incarcerated. So basically it's telling CDCR to rewrite their regulations around work and assignment to other types of activities that people do during the day in addition to work, like school. So, and then the Constitution, if Prop 6 passed, would prohibit prisons from disciplining people who refuse to work. So then it kind of becomes a question of how CDCR interprets that in writing their revised regulations. I hope that helps.
Yeah, another question?
I see it supported by sort of the Anti-Recidivism Association, or is this anticipated to have any effect on recidivism?
That wasn't part of our analysis, so I don't have an answer for you, yeah. I mean, I suppose to the extent it results in more people ending up participating in evidence-based programs that reduce recidivism while they're in prison, such as substance use disorder treatment, for example, or getting job training, for example, which people can do through work programs, then it could have an impact on recidivism. To the extent it does the opposite of that, results in less people participating in those programs that address whatever their criminogenic needs are, then it could potentially, result in more recidivism. So it kind of depends on how it's implemented, I would say.
And one more question.
I think that this idea of, what PIL, prison inmate labor, is
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I think that the notion of what PIL is kind of an interesting concept that was brought up earlier. And I was wondering, does CDCR provide information on how much prison inmate labor is actually part of their system, percentage-wise? Are we talking half the prisoners, 90% of the prisoners, 10%?
I think it's roughly a third of folks have a job. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. And is there any research that shows that those folks are, actually doing it to pass the time, actually make a few bucks, actually enjoy the work? Does anybody have any research on that?
research on why people are participating in work programs inside prison.
Yes.
I don't know about research about why individuals choose to participate. It's possible that that research exists. I'm not familiar with it. From speaking to people and talking to the department in the course of analyzing this, it does seem like there's a variety of reasons people might choose to work, in addition to the fact that they can be required to if that's what they're assigned to. But people, can earn money which they can spend on goods in the canteen. They also, in some cases, can earn time off their prison sentence. They can get a skill. There's maybe they enjoy being engaged in doing something during the day. So I think there could be a variety of different reasons. But I can't speak to, if there's been research on that specifically.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. It just kind of surprises me that even with this carrot and stick process that there aren't more people that engage. It's surprising.
All right, let's move on to Proposition 32.
So just a little background first. California has a basic statewide minimum wage, currently set at $16 an hour, and that is adjusted annually in a way that's based on U.S. inflation up to 3.5%. And there also are a variety of local governments in California that set higher minimum wages. And the state also has a couple of minimum wage laws that apply to specific types of employers. So one that applies to most fast food establishments, and another that went into effect, I believe, this week, that affects certain types of workers at certain types of healthcare facilities. And so going back to that basic statewide minimum wage and the inflation adjustments, so it's officially been announced under current law, to increase to $16.50 an hour in 2025, and we project that under current law it would then be around $17 an hour in 2026. So then what Proposition 32 would do would be to accelerate those short-term increases. So rather than the statewide minimum wage being around $17 an hour in 2026, it would go up a little bit faster and hit $18 an hour in 2026 instead. And subsequently, the inflation adjustments would work exactly the same way they do under current law. So sort of going forward, the statewide minimum wage would be around 5 to 8% higher than it would be under current law. Fiscal effects. The fiscal effects of Proposition 32 in large part would depend on the economic effects of the measure, and so we highlight a few of the significant ones. First of all, that wages for many workers would be higher. Of course, they would need to be at least $18 an hour by 2026, but also some workers who would otherwise make a bit more than $18 an hour also would get a raise due to the labor market effects of the measure. Second significant economic effect would be that prices of certain goods and services likely would increase, sort of in terms of the overall basket of things that consumers buy. The overall price increases from the measure likely would total less than 1/2 of 1%. Profits for certain businesses likely would be lower, would be the third significant economic effect. And the fourth one would be an effect on employment that plausibly could be positive or negative in terms of the state's total jobs, and likely would not be any larger than about 1/4 of 1% of the state's total employment. So with sort of those as some of the highlights of the economic effects, there could be a variety of fiscal effects on state and local governments, and we put them into essentially three categories. The first category is that there are certain state and local government programs whose costs are directly affected by compensation for low-wage workers, and so this measure would increase those costs. Second category is that due to the effects of the measure on workers' incomes, sort of enrollment in certain health and social services programs would be lower under the measure, or likely would be lower. And so combining those two pieces, there is a fair bit of uncertainty in the magnitude in some of them. And so on net, the effect of the measure on state and local government spending could be a net increase or decrease, but the net change likely would not exceed the high hundreds of millions of dollars annually. And then the third piece of the fiscal effects are the effects on state and local tax revenues. And so due to the measure's effects on incomes for various people as well as prices, it likely would affect income and sales tax revenues. On net, we estimate that it would reduce state and local tax revenues by an amount that could total perhaps as much as a few $100 million annually.
Great. So this got on by signatures on petitions. So the endorsements: labor organizations, One Fair Wage, Working Families Party California, United Farm Workers, the Democratic Party, and the League of Women Voters. And then against, the Chamber of Commerce, the California Restaurant Association, Grocers Association, Federation of Independent Businesses, and the California Republican Party, and then Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. The newspapers are a bit split again. Mercury News, San Francisco Chronicle, and LA Times support it. And then in opposition, the Pasadena Star News and the Bakersfield Californian. In support, we have Kevin DeLeon's campaign again. That's most of the money. And then in opposition, we have growers and agriculture, farmers, and more agriculture, and the Grocers Association again. So it's a bunch of organizations that would end up paying additional wages, basically. And the funding is a little bit more matched for this one, 609, almost 610 million raised so far, and then against $526,000. What questions do you have about Prop 32? Do we have questions amongst ourselves for Prop 32? Okay, we will move on then. We will move on then to Prop 33.
Great. Good evening. The essential question in Prop 33 is the scope of local rent control laws that should be allowed under state law. State law now currently allows municipalities to enact local rent control rules, but there are certain parameters that state law puts in place that limit the scope of those rules. There's three main limitations under current law. The first is that local rent control cannot apply to any single-family homes. The second is that it can only apply to older homes. It can't apply to anything built after 1995. And the third is that these local rent control rules must allow for so-called vacancy decontrol, and this essentially means they can only dictate how much a landlord can increase rents for an existing tenant. They can't say how much they can increase the rent when a new tenant moves in. So Prop 33 would essentially repeal that existing state law that puts these three limitations in place in its entirety. This would mean there would be no state restrictions on the type or scope of local rent control rules. Prop 33 in and of itself wouldn't make any changes to local rent control rules, but we think it is likely that at least some municipalities would use this new authority to expand the scope of their local rent control laws. An expansion of local rent control could have a variety of economic effects, and I'll summarize them by talking about kind of effects on three categories of individuals. The first are some portion of renters that would that would gain access to additional units of rent-controlled housing. And for those renters, they would receive a financial benefit largely in the form of lower rents than they would otherwise pay. Other renters, though, who do not gain access to rent control, and this would likely represent the majority of renters in the state, barring a significant expansion of local rent control as it stands today, for those renters, they likely would face both some increase in the rents that they pay and a decrease in the availability of rentals, making it possibly harder for them to find a home to rent. The third group of individuals is landlords, who would likely see a decrease in their incomes and also probably a decrease in the value of their rental properties. The primary fiscal effect that we estimate from the measure flows from this last piece, and it's that with the value of rental properties likely declining, we think that property taxes going to local governments would decline by at least tens of millions of dollars per year.
All right, so this is related to the next measure in that the AIDS Healthcare Foundation funded this and put most of the money behind getting it on the ballot, but also the advertising afterwards. They get federal reduced drug prices in order to serve their clientele, but some of that money has been used this time and in several recent elections on funding measures related to housing. And so this is one, there was one in 2018, I believe, and we've had several in recent years that have failed. So that it's on the ballot again. So in support, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, California Democratic Party, Veterans Voices, the Nurses Association, the Alliance for Retired Americans, Housing is a Human Right, Tenants Together, et cetera. So it's housing groups. In opposition, it's mostly renters groups and the Chamber of Commerce, some Republicans, Senator Tony Atkins, though, and Buffy Wicks, those are Democrats, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. And then there are no newspapers in support of this, but there are multiple newspapers in opposition. And I encourage you to read those, look them up if you want more details on the reasoning on these things. So the AIDS Healthcare Foundation put most of the money towards this. So, 540, my glasses, I'm getting it to that age, 549 million. And then in opposition, we've got apartment associations, associations of realtors, essentially organizations that would be impacted by the rent control. So the funding, we have for and against. The against is 92 million, almost, a little over, and 49 million that are for, so there's quite a bit more raised against this measure. What questions do you have on Prop 33?
Hi, thank you. I actually just signed, we're moving into a house in a few weeks, and I just signed a clause saying, the single family home I'm moving into to rent is not rent control, is not fall into the protection of rent control. And I thought oh, bummer, they're gonna, when this lease is up, they're just gonna gouge me. And I remember thinking oh, I would want that. But did you say that the effect on low income folks would be, I didn't quite catch what you said on how it would impact folks who are low income and who might need to move. It would make it harder for them to move and acquire housing?
Yeah, sorry. Let me try to summarize a few of the things that I said again. One is that Prop 33 passing wouldn't immediately make any changes to any of those kind of local rent control rules. So it would require, cities to take future action. Cities, both elected officials and voters, take future actions to expand those rules. So, for example, if in the future the city of Sacramento, after Prop 33 passed, they would have the authority to then maybe go ahead and pass a rent control that does apply to single-family homes. The distinction that I was making about how this could have sort of disparate effects on renters is that that there would be, even with expansion of local rent control rules, it's only a minority of cities now that have some sort of rent control in the state. The vast majority don't. probably, you know, that number would increase, but there would still be some number of rent-controlled units and probably a majority of rentals that aren't covered by rent control. And so it would sort of have disparate effects on renters. Those who essentially were able to access those rent-controlled units that are sort of in limited supply, right? There wouldn't be enough for everyone. So those who were able to get into one of those, they would financially benefit from this expansion. But the folks who don't gain access to rent control and they're renting from a unit that isn't covered, probably the rents could end up being somewhat higher for those. And in part because one effect of rent control can be for sort of the supply of rental housing to decline. And the primary driver of that is that some landlords essentially just decide to get out of the business of renting. They might, you know, sell it to someone who's going to own it and live there, or turn it into an Airbnb or whatever. So it can reduce the number of rentals. That can make it harder for the folks who didn't get in a rent-controlled unit to find something and make it more expensive for them.
Thank you.
Other questions on this one? All right, let's move on to Proposition 34.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me? All right, awesome. So Proposition 34 creates new rules on certain kinds of healthcare entities, like clinics, pharmacies, or health insurance plans. And specifically, it would create new rules around the money that these entities earn from a federal program that provides them discounted prices on prescription drugs. Healthcare entities earn money from this program because they get reimbursed by healthcare payers, such as health insurance plans. They get that reimbursement's higher than the discounted price of the drug that they purchased the drug for. And currently, there are no federal or state laws that directly control how entities spend this money. And so this would reflect a change in law by creating new rules in state law. Now, under the measure, entities would have to spend at least 98% of this money on healthcare provided directly to patients. And entities that do not meet these requirements would face certain penalties, such as loss of tax-exempt status or loss of licensure. One key thing to keep in mind about this measure is that it doesn't apply universally to all entities. Instead, the rules would only apply to the entities if they meet certain conditions. If you have your voter guide available, on page 47, figure 1, we summarize the 4 conditions that an entity would have to meet for the rules to apply to them. Just as an example, in addition to an entity participating in the drug discount program, the entity would also have to own and operate multifamily housing units and have a certain number of violations. And that's just one condition of a few that are listed here. Given these conditions, it's likely that few entities would fall under the measure's rules, and you can just imagine already, few healthcare entities already operate and provide housing, so already that is a limiting factor, and then there are several other factors that would apply too. In terms of the fiscal effects, this measure would create costs to the state to enforce the measure's new rules, which we estimate to be in the millions of dollars annually. The measure allows the state to cover this cost by charging fees on entities that are affected by the rules. Now, there are a number of other fiscal effects that could happen as a result of the measure. We walk through some of these potential effects on page 49 of your voter guide. Generally, they would depend on how the measure might affect healthcare entities' behavior around how they spend this money, or to the extent an entity is found to be in violation of the rules, that there could be effects there. These effects are uncertain, but generally would be limited on a statewide basis, and that's again because likely few entities would fall under the measure's rules. Thank you.
All right, so this one is pretty unusual in that the petition signatures were gathered by a trade group for California's landlords, which seems odd for this sort of a measure. And the reason is that it is tailored to apply to only one organization, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Okay, and that's the one that was responsible for the previous measure that was about rent control. So it's a targeted measure at one particular organization, which is very rare. And that's why some organizations are opposing it, not on the substance, but based on the targeting factor. So in support, we have the California Apartment Association, ALS Association, Assemblymember Evan Lowe, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers, California Chamber of Commerce, and the Republican Party. And then in opposition, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, of course, and then the Consumer Watchdog. Support is the Southern California News Group, and then in opposition for newspapers, we have the San Francisco Chronicle, the Mercury News, San Diego Union Tribune, and the LA Times. And then in support, we have basically it's realtors and rental operators organizations. And then in opposition, we have the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and a specific group formed for this, and the Pro-California Action Fund. So there's more money for this than against. That's sort of almost a little more than double that's for it. So you may see lopsided campaign advertising as well. Questions?
This was one of those that was really confusing for me. I just couldn't understand what the whole point of it was. And when you said that it was targeted to one group, I guess, can you explain that a little bit more? Because I'm still kind of fuzzy on what they're trying to do.
Well, it's structured such that it only applies to that one group, so there are lots of very specific requirements, as the LAO was mentioning, and it just happens to be the case that only the one group ends up fitting all the criteria. And it seems to be essentially targeting them because the landlords don't want rent control, and the rent control measures keep being sponsored by the AIDS Foundation. All right. I haven't seen one like this before, so, here we are. Prop 35.
All right, and folks, there's, 2 measures left, so you're almost at the home stretch.
Yeah. Pie time, almost.
So Proposition 35 is a measure about a state tax called the Managed Care Organization, or MCO tax. And this is a tax, it's a special state tax on health insurance plans, such as Kaiser or Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And it raises about $7.5 billion to the state each year currently. The state uses this money generally to support Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal is the state's Medicaid program. It covers the cost of health care for low-income people. Now, most of the money from the tax currently is used to help support the existing Medi-Cal program. This means the state doesn't have to spend as much money from other sources, and so it ends up saving the state money. A smaller portion of the revenue is used to support increased services to the Medi-Cal program, for example, higher reimbursement rates to providers. Now, this proposal does 2 key things with the MCO tax. The first is that it permanently approves it under state law. So currently, this tax is allowed in state law on a temporary basis. It ends at the end of 2026. So beginning in 2027, under the measure, the tax would become permanent and remain in effect without having to get approval from the legislature. That said, one important thing to keep in mind is that this tax also requires federal approval to go into effect, and federal approval tends to be for limited periods of time, and that wouldn't change under the measure. So under the measure, the state would still have to periodically seek federal approval to continue to charge the tax. The second thing the tax does is it creates rules around how the state spends the resulting revenue from the tax. Now, the rules are a little complicated. There are one set of rules in the short term in 2025 and 2026, and then another set of rules in 2027. But generally, what these rules would do is require the state to use more money from the MCO tax to increase fund services in Medi-Cal rather than help pay for existing services. In addition, the measure would also require, would provide increases to different kinds of services in Medi-Cal. So if you turn to page, sorry, I didn't get to the page immediately, but if you turn to page 54 of your voter guide on figure 1, that summarizes the services under current law that get increased services, and then it also shows what would get funding increases under Proposition 35. And you can see there's some crossover between the two, but there also are some that get increases under current law but not the measure, and then some that would get increases under the measure but not current law. In terms of the fiscal effects, in our view, it's helpful to think about the different fiscal effects in the short term, specifically 2025 and 2026, and then in the long term, beginning in 2027. In terms of the short term, there really are two key effects I want to highlight. The first is that the measure likely would result in more funding for the Medi-Cal program. And that's because under the rules, the state would have to use more of the tax revenue to provide increased services to Medi-Cal. And when the state provides more funding to Medi-Cal, there typically is also matching funds from the federal government. And so as a result of that, we estimate that the funding increase to Medi-Cal would be between $2 to $5 billion each year in 2025 and 2026. And then second, in addition to that funding increase, there also would be a cost to the state. And again, that's because less money would be available to save the state money. We estimate that cost would be between $1 to $2 billion each year in 2025 and 2026. Now, looking to the long term, beginning in 2027, in our view, these effects really are unknown. And they're unknown because there are lots of uncertain factors at play. Just to give one example, under the measure, the tax would become permanent beginning in 2027. So you could imagine that the measure could result in billions of dollars more tax revenue to the state. However, this tax has been in effect for more than a decade, and the state has a long history of approving the tax for a temporary period of time and then renewing it for another temporary period and then renewing again and renewing again. We've done this for a few times over the last more than 10 years. So it's very possible the state would continue to renew the tax even absent the measure. In that case, the measure might not have any impact on tax revenues. And there are other factors at play here that make sort of the overall impact uncertain in our view. Thank you.
All right, so it's healthcare industry groups that qualified this one for the ballot in the first place because they feel that the rates that they're paid for reimbursement for Medicare are too low. So in support, we have the California Medical Association, Planned Parenthood of California, Hospital Association, Dental Association, Primary Care Association, and both major political parties once more. And in opposition, the League of Women Voters of California, the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network, the Children's Partnership, California Alliance for Retired Americans, and Courage California. In support, as far as newspapers go, we have the Sacramento Bee, and then in opposition, the other newspapers that have staked out a position here. In support, we essentially have healthcare organizations throughout the state, and then in opposition in terms of funding, no one has put up money to oppose this one. So it's extremely lopsided, $52 million in favor and no money raised against. What questions do you have?
Just a quick question about the funding increase. So is this that the funding increases under Prop 35 will replace the current funding increases, or is it in addition to?
Yeah, they would replace the current increases. So the state would have to follow the rules as set forth by Proposition 35. So those would replace the increases that have been adopted in current law.
And so the only thing I'd be concerned about is what certain long-term supports and community healthcare workers would be not receiving any more funding. Just the phrase certain long-term supports, I just wonder what that kind of thing is.
Yeah, I don't have the complete list in front of me, but an example would be community-based adult services. I was trying to remember what the acronym stands for. So those would be one example. I think pediatric day health centers would be another service that's sort of affected. So they are, as you said, it's not every long-term support that was sort of given an increase. It's very specific types of providers.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Last but not least, Proposition 36.
All right. Proposition 36 would make several changes to state sentencing law, and those would fall into three primary components. The first is that it would increase punishment for some theft and drug crimes, and it would do so primarily through three mechanisms, which are that it would turn some misdemeanors into felonies. It would lengthen some sentences for crimes that are currently felonies, and it would require some felonies to be served in state prison instead of county jail. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to provide one example, though I'm happy to get into more details in the questions. And that example is that one of the cases of where the measure would turn a misdemeanor into a felony. And so currently, theft of items worth $950 or less is generally a misdemeanor. Under Prop 36, this crime would become a felony if the individual has 2 or more past convictions for certain theft-related crimes like burglary or shoplifting. Moving on to the second kind of major component of the measure, the Prop 36 would allow people who possess illegal drugs to be charged with a treatment, what the measure terms a treatment-mandated felony, instead of a misdemeanor if they meet 2 criteria. The first is that they're possessing certain drugs, and those include fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamine. And 2, they have 2 or more past convictions for certain drug crimes like drug possession or selling drugs. These people would generally get treatment, like mental health or drug treatment, and those who finish treatment would have their charges dismissed. Those who do not finish treatment could be required to serve a prison or jail sentence. And then the third component of the measure is that it would require courts to warn people that they could be charged with murder in the future if they sell or provide drugs to somebody who then dies as a result of taking those drugs. So, and it would specifically require the courts to issue that warning to people who are convicted of selling or providing certain drugs, including fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. And that warning could make it more likely for those people to be convicted of murder in the future if they continue selling or providing drugs and someone does indeed die from those drugs. In terms of the fiscal impact of the measure, we estimate that it would increase state criminal justice costs, likely in the several tens of millions of dollars to the low hundreds of millions of dollars annually, primarily due to an increase in the state prison population. We estimate that it would increase local criminal justice costs in the tens of millions of dollars annually, primarily due to the cost of providing the treatment related to the treatment-mandated felony that I spoke about, as well as a net increase in the county jail and community supervision population. And the final fiscal effect is a bit complicated, but at a high level, it would, the measure would reduce the amount that the state is required to spend under requirements in existing law on certain programs that are generally related to treatment and recidivism reduction, truancy prevention, and victim services. It would reduce that required spending amount by, we estimate, in the low tens of millions, and it's currently at around $95 million a year. Thank you.
All right, this was put on the ballot by signatures, and the endorsements are, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, organizations that suffer from shoplifting, basically. District Attorneys Association, Correctional Peace Officers, the Republican Party, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, and the California Chamber of Commerce. And then in opposition, we have the governor, several leaders of the state legislature, the Alliance for Safety and Justice, ACLU of Northern California, the Democratic Party, the League of Women Voters of California, and the Council on American Islamic Relations of California. In support, as far as newspapers go, we have the Mercury News and the San Diego Union Tribune. And then in opposition, the LA Times, the Sacramento Bee, and the Southern California News Group. As far as funding goes, again, we've got companies that suffer from shoplifting, Business Roundtable, In-N-Out Burger, Taylor's Fresh Foods, Rayleigh's 7-Eleven, peace officers. And then in opposition, we have some individuals and the Council for Working People, California Federation of Teachers, ACLU of Northern California. And then we, again, have lopsided funding on this one with a lot more money raised in favor of it and less against, and a pretty high amount, period. Questions on Prop 36? It's all crystal clear? Okay. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. I did want to give us our reference list, so if you wanted to look any of these up, we will post these slides on the website. And thank the College of Social Sciences and Interdisciplinary Studies at Sacramento State, the Department of Political Science, the LAO, obviously, Sac Public Library, and then anonymous donors to our organization. And thank you, of course, for coming.